Welcome back to Dark Souls 3, everyone. Today, we learn the true meaning of technical difficulty. So before we begin, a little bit of background. At around this time, I had recently been more or less coerced into installing Windows 10 on this computer. Because, if I didn't, then it was going to do it for me. So, I decided, okay, fine, might as well get this out of the way. I did it, and then everything broke forever. Most notably, when I tried to play this game, or any other game, the frame rate would simply just start chugging and stuttering for no reason whatsoever. I was hoping that it wouldn't be noticeable upon recording, but here we are. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to re-record things in this game. So we're sort of stuck with choppy frame rate mess for a little bit, and I apologize for that. Wasn't much fun to play either like this. Especially when you get invaded. The input delay becomes... Ugh, this is painful to watch. Yeah, but anyway, enough about that. Let's actually talk about the video game. Hidden behind the Abyss Watchers is the Catacombs of Carthus. Well, if he's gonna gesture, I might as well too. Etiquette and all that. I'm not gonna be a poor sport just because my computer is exploding. The Catacombs of Carthus is home almost exclusively to skeletons. And to counter this threat, I'm using a unique weapon that we picked up back in the Cathedral of the Deep. This is the Executioner's Greatsword. And despite being a greatsword, it does blunt damage, which is extremely effective against skeletons. Slashing damage, and especially piercing damage, does not much at all. The Executioner's Greatsword also has a secondary ability that is very useful to magic users, because every time you kill an enemy with it, you get some focus points back. It's not a huge amount, but it's appreciable, and it keeps you going just a little bit longer. Now, a few words about skeletons, one of my favorite topics. Some of the skeletons in the catacombs will revive upon death. Now, this isn't a situation like in previous Dark Souls games where this is governed by the presence of enemy necromancers. It's instead predetermined. Skeletons with a white glow in their eye will resurrect upon death once. If they have no glow, then they will stay dead. Skeletons with red eyes are Carthus rogues, which are much more powerful versions of the regular enemies that have some specialized weaponry. They usually do not revive, but there are a couple of exceptions. Another easy way to tell is if you get souls upon their death or not. If you don't, it means that they're going to revive. Revived skeletons honestly make fairly easy targets, but if you're not entirely sure of the mechanics behind them, they can catch you off guard. That Pyromancy Tome holds some very useful spells. And here's another illusory wall with some interesting properties. So I can pretty much see the entire game world from here. It's not a big deal. As far as I'm aware, this is not intended behavior. And as far as I'm aware, there's no way down from here. And at this point, I'm basically freaking out because of everything wrong that has happened in this, thus far, 5 minutes long recording. So I just decide to see if I can get off normally. Like, if I fall, will I fall off the world? Will I go back into the world? I probably should have used a homeward bone, but I didn't have the presence of mind. Rest in peace. The catacombs can be a difficult area, but usually not for that reason. Usually. Fortunately, we have a surplus of embers, and we never really got that far into the dungeon in the first place. A word about the Executioner's Greatsword is that it is somewhat difficult to wield for a caster character, so you'll probably need to either two-hand it or put in some significant stat investment. It can also be useful for builds that primarily focus on weapons, but simply make a great use of weapon arts. It would be nice if it was a little lighter and easier to use, otherwise it would be a perfect sorcerer offhand weapon, but as it is, it does take a little bit of an investment to get the most out of. Let's try this again, see how it goes. Naturally, my bloodstain is still outside of the world, so those 2,700 souls that we had at the time, we will have to wave goodbye to. I'm not especially heartbroken, but it is a little frustrating. Nice mood lighting, though. Very green. I'm also going to show off a new spell here. Boulder Heave. We got this from the Stray Demon. Its utility is somewhat limited, but it's actually very effective against the skeletons in here. We will see why when I demo it, which will be eventually. The catacombs are a bit maze-like, and they do have more illusionary walls than most other areas in the game. They also have traps. While traversing, you need to keep a careful eye out for various pressure plates that protrude out of the ground. The arrows that they shoot do hurt quite a bit, but you can also use them to your advantage by luring enemies into their line of fire. There's lots of little nooks and crannies in this area for skeleton archers to hide. So if you're not thorough or you're not paying attention, you can easily get peppered by arrows when you're not looking. The Carthus rogues are fairly fearsome foes, but the rewards for defeating them are quite valuable. And they also have a bit of a weakness in that they're very weak to blunt damage, like all skeletons, and you can pretty much stun lock them if you hit them with heavy enough attacks, because they need to sort of reassemble themselves. There we go. That's the boulder toss. The boulder toss, incidentally, does exactly that. It does a hell of a lot of poise damage, and it completely knocks these skeletons on their butts. Which, as one might expect, makes them a lot less threatening. You may have also noticed that the rogues will occasionally disappear from the screen. This is not a bug, or any sort of unintended behavior. It's actually a special ability of Carthus foot soldiers.
Oh, hello. How very fortunate. Have you seen my companion, Horus? To my shame, I was snared by a trap, and we've become separated. I've not been able to find him since. Yes, I see. Horus is a valiant knight. He can look after himself, no question. He's probably searching for me right now, with twice the resolve. If you happen upon him, please tell him that I remained in the catacombs, and I will lay prison stones to guide him, as always. Please send him word, I beg of you. May the flames guide your way. If you happen upon Horus, please tell him that I remain in the catacombs and will lay prison stones to guide him, as always. Please send him word, I beg of you. May the flames guide your way.
Seems like Anri and Horus have had a bit of trouble. Though there are no shortage of traps around here, so I can't really blame them for getting lost or separated. Certainly, if we see Horus, I will be more than happy to tell him what Anri has said. He might not talk, but I imagine he can hear fine enough. We'll keep an eye out for him either way. It'd certainly be hard to miss wearing that distinctive turtle-like armor. The reason I like Boulder Heave here is that it has a little bit more base power than Fire Orb against the skeletons, because they have no weakness to flame. It's a little bit slower and it has much inferior range. That wasn't quite what I intended. It's a little bit slower and it has inferior range, but it's more efficient per cast. Which on a long trek can make the difference between victory and defeat. Not so much since we're using the Executioner's Greatsword, though. That goes a long way to making our spells last. It should be noted that some skeletons are capable of riposting your attacks. If they take a defensive posture and you attack them while they're doing it, then you can actually get a very blistering counterattack that can kill you outright if you're not at high health. These skeletons with the large falchions are fond of it. Lacking one arm and a head doesn't seem to have dulled their abilities to counter your attacks. Fortunately, you can't riposte magic, so simply throwing fireballs or boulders at them is a perfectly valid tactic for simply circumventing that particular danger. It's a bit of a pain to go down the stairs, but it beats taking half our life bar and fall damage. A lot of the areas in the catacombs tend to sort of blend together visually, so you need to pay attention to where you're going and where you've been. Well, if this bloodstain is any indication, then there is something worth noting on this bridge, and this is it. This rolling boulder trap is a classic, but I have to admit, most of these that I've seen A, are not made entirely out of skeletons, and B, do not actually come back up the other way. Simply evading this the first time is not sufficient. It will continue to roll back and forth until the end of time if left alone, and none of our weapons can really scratch the giant mass of bone. So hopefully we'll find a solution down here. If not, we'll simply have to bypass it entirely. There's an ember over there, but first we have to take care of this fellow. These skeletons wearing worker hats do not attack you and will actually flee upon being attacked. But that doesn't mean you should leave them alone, because they're the ones in charge of maintaining the bone sphere. This particular bone sphere has some undead bone ash in it. So, it's really in your best interest to make sure that you grab that. It's very easy to miss the first time through. The worker skeletons tend to hide, and they are very good at not making their presence known to you, especially if you're madly trying to avoid other skeletons and the giant bone orb. How sad. You can also pierce through riposte defense with super heavy weapons. I'm not sure, actually, if the Executioner's Greatsword counts for that. It's fairly heavy, but it's not an ultra greatsword or a great hammer. We run into some new traps and enemy varieties down here. Most notably, the skeletons that throw hexing urns. These urns release affinity-type projectiles upon release. And they are quite persistent in their proclivity to home in on you. They don't do a lot of damage, but it adds up over time because they will spam the hell out of them. Those special urns that are covered with cloth also release them upon being broken, so that functions as a fairly effective trap if you're not paying attention or you don't know that it's there. You can very easily just roll about like you usually do with pots in a Dark Souls game and find yourself with a screen filled to the brim with affinity. Our reward for navigating this trap is the Carthus milk ring, which is actually what those Carthus rogues are wearing. When you equip this ring, you actually become invisible when you roll. It's not hugely useful against AI or living opponents, but it's kind of cool, and the ring does have the bonus attribute of giving you a little bit more dexterity. This is one of the rare Carthus rogues that can revive itself. Fortunately, if you know it's coming, you can simply camp the corpse and beat it down the minute it reforms. Going through this area with lighter weapons can be a bit of a challenge, because otherwise, the rogues have fairly good poise. They are also fond of inflicting bleeding, which can hurt an awful lot. Here's what I hoped to be an example of using a trap against the enemies, but it didn't really work out the way I wanted it to. Now I'm forced into a 2-on-1 battle. I've managed to stagger them a little bit, and I did manage to catch one in a trap. So it's not all bad, but this is still not a great position to be in for such a squishy build. do love to spam that roll. The invisibility effect can honestly be very effective against you, the player, simply because they can cover pretty vast distances quickly without revealing themselves. So you sort of have to just pray to lock on that you manage to interrupt them in time. It reminds me of a certain mechanic in a certain fight in a certain video game that I may or may not have done a long time ago. Sometimes you just have to wonder, why can these guys go invisible? Still, we managed to make it through that encounter without grievous bodily harm, so we're in okay shape. If you're looking out for them, the pressure plates that trigger the arrows are fairly easy to see, so just don't rush through it. Take your time. As I mentioned earlier, there is in fact more than one giant bone orb. This one guards a much appreciated bonfire. This is sort of the midpoint of the Catacombs area. It can seem quite sprawling, but it's actually a bit more linear than the preceding Farron Keep was, wherein you could tackle that area pretty much in whatever way you wanted. And I guess it has that going for it. I haven't really been using any heavy weapons before this, so this is as good a time as any to talk about the unique poise properties that they give you. Despite the fact that I'm wearing very light armor, I managed to simply tank through those hits without much difficulty. That is because in Dark Souls 3, most of your poise is determined by what weapon you're using. Since I'm using a big old heavy greatsword, those rat attacks couldn't knock me out of my swing. This is a scripted NPC invasion. However, that doesn't make it any less dangerous. Knight Slayer Tsorig wields a somewhat familiar-looking greatsword and a familiar suit of armor, and he just killed me in one hit. But he was nice enough to give me a gesture in return, so I suppose we can forgive him. The wages of wearing light armor and not putting too much into vitality, I guess. It is highly unlikely that we will be able to defeat Tsorig in a greatsword battle. He is much better equipped for it. Thus, it's time to change tactics. Magic will work okay against him, but his armor is actually highly resistant to fire. Also, sometimes if you're lucky, the bone orb will actually take out those rats and skeletons for you. We faced this giant rat a while ago back in the Undead Settlement sewers. It remains a fairly unimpressive enemy. Now, you do want to defeat Knight Slayer Tsorig, even if you get his gesture from being defeated by him. Both because it's somewhat humiliating, and because he drops something nice. never try to trade blows with an ultra greatsword. This environment actually favors him quite a bit. There's not a lot of room to get around him, and his sword has tremendous lateral reach. However, it's also very slow, so he does leave himself open on occasion. If he puts up his shield, then there is a chance to simply wail on that until you manage to stagger him, though his black iron shield has very high stability, so it's kind of difficult to do that without leaving yourself open to a really quite painful counterattack. No fear. This is a somewhat easier fight if you have more of a safety net than I do, but that goes for a lot of what happens in this game with this character. Our reward is the Night Slayer's Ring, which, like I mentioned earlier, will help get you through shield defenses. It takes off more stamina for each hit blocked. A useful ring to have against certain enemies. Would have been nice for that fight, actually. Welcome to Slime Town. This entire corridor is filled to the brim with slimes and a certain other enemy type. You can see them in the distance. The bone meal skeletons. Bone meal skeletons are much less dangerous in this game than they are in previous games. Fire is hard. As I was saying, the bone meal skeletons tend to attack you simply via charging you at high speeds. Now, in Dark Souls 1, this was a problem because your character was fairly immobile. Fire is really hard. Sometimes the best course of action is just to bait them into dropping down. If you don't have any fire with you, this can take forever. In Dark Souls 2, not Dark Souls 2, but actually yes, in Dark Souls 2 as well, but in Dark Souls 3, you have quite a few more mobility options than you did in the first game. Your character in general just moves a bit snappier. So it's much easier to get out of the way in time of a rampaging bone wheel. They can still really fuck you up if you get them into a state where they're ramming against your shield over and over again. But this game just sort of encourages that a lot less, so you're less likely to get into that unfortunate situation. I may have thought that slime was still alive. They take a while to die. It can be confusing. Like all skeletons, the bone wheel skeletons tend to have difficulty with singular strong attacks that do a lot of damage because they will have to reform themselves afterward, which leaves them open to further singular strong attacks. There are yet more slimes, of course. If you're not a pyromancer, you should bring a healthy supply of firebombs or black firebombs to this area. It will severely speed up how you go through here. Trying to cut through with sorcery, miracles, or just raw physical damage will not get you far. At least not very quickly. The Carthus Blood Ring is a counterpart to the Carthus Melt Ring, and thus also affects rolling. However, the blood ring is quite a bit more useful, albeit somewhat dangerous. In exchange for increasing the amount of damage that you take, it increases the invincibility frames on your dodge rolls by a fairly significant margin. The exact number escapes me at the moment, but it's pretty big. I think it's almost like 9 frames or something. Which might not sound like much, but I believe that like the default fast roll dodge is only like 14 or so. I can't quite remember, it's been a while. This variety of Carthus rogue is probably the most dangerous. They like to flip around and throw kunai at you. Kukri, sorry, not kunai. Even their throwing daggers will inflict bleeding, so they can be pretty difficult to deal with. This one even revives after death, which can be really difficult to deal with. You can tell because even in the rogues, the white glow will override the red glow that they normally have. There's some nice goodies up here, particularly those ashes. But proportionally, they are guarded by some fairly fearsome opposition. Rogue archers are fairly rare, and they're not particularly difficult to deal with. They don't have a lot of health, and they can only shoot so many arrows at you at a time. And let us not forget this fellow. Killing him will get rid of that bone orb below. Though they do respawn, so it's not a permanent solution. A little bit of petty mischief on my part, but I'm allowed every now and again. Inside this bone orb is a dark gem and, somewhat bafflingly, a small crab. I am sure of neither how he got there or how he is still alive, but I feel that he has probably suffered enough, so let's just leave him be. Well, at least I'm not the only one falling through the world. I don't even have to worry about losing the loot anymore. Sometimes you're alright, Dark Souls 3. Sometimes it's nice to patches the fuck out of somebody. That developer left message, the suspended bridge is wearing thin, is a bit of a hint. The suspended bridge in question is indeed wearing thin, and thus we should avoid it. This path is much safer, and it also holds a friend. Anri has somehow beaten us here.
Oh, hello. We meet again. Have you seen Horus anywhere? Oh, yes. I see. I've searched high and low, with no luck. Perhaps he's left the catacombs. Oh, Horus. Where have you run off to? Oh, Horus. Where have you run off to? Have you abandoned me? No. What a horrible thought.
you look closely, that looks like a Horus-shaped person down there. Still, Anri's wearing that knight's helmet. I can't really blame him. As these signs are so helpfully pointing out to us, a single attack to this bridge will cause it to collapse. And the nice thing about rickety plank bridges is that you can use them as ladders if you so desire. Of course, things are never quite so simple. Blocking our way on this route is an angry fire demon. The flamestone plate ring will help. Unfortunately, when your weapon is so big you can clip through the wall, nothing really helps against that. I think that'll do it for one episode. Next time we'll go and avenge ourselves on that dirty wall hacker. But for now, I think it's time for a rest. Hopefully we said hi to Horus when we fell, though I can imagine it might have slipped our minds.